Hey everybody, it is April 2021 and we have come down to the end of the public forum regular season with the last new topic of the year for April, which is resolve the benefits of the International Monetary Fund outweigh the harms. It's a good topic, I think. It's a really broad topic, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. As always, we hope these videos that we put out on Hail State Debate are useful to you, so if they are, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. And as always, we will have all of the sources that we cite in the links below, along with timestamps if you need to come back and watch a particular section. And if you're interested in following our sort of general musings on life and debate, you can always follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate. So, like I said, this is a really big, broad, complicated topic. Overall, I like it. I think it's pretty good. Not perfect, but a good topic. I think it's really good for debaters to have to spend some time looking at these major institutions that sort of shape our world and asking whether or not, the assumptions that they embody and the values they reflect are good and just, right? Before you tackle a topic like this, you've heard of the IMF, you have a general sense that it's something financial, but you don't really know, what it does. You don't know who's pulling the strings, who they're working for, who arguably maybe they're working against in some cases. And that's one of the best things that debate does, is it educates us on these institutions and it forces us to question our assumptions. So that's good. The only real problem I have with it is that it may be just a little bit too broad and too high concept, with too many ideas floating around out there to really master in the span of a month. I know it's been challenging for me to get ready for it. And I think there are a lot of economic concepts built into it that frankly are just hard to really master and wrap your brain around in the space of a month or two, which means if you're going to do really well, this is going to be a topic where hard work is going to be certainly rewarded. Because it is a big topic, right? There's a lot of backstory that you need to understand about the IMF itself, right? There are also some conceptual ideas that you need to understand, not just the particulars like what is a structural adjustment program that the IMF imposes, but also economic concepts like currency devaluation, the balance of payments, being the lender of last resort. You have to be conversant in things like this, right? We're going to do our best to try to cover these efficiently, but it's very hard in an hour and change, right? So there is no substitute for reading on this topic, right? No substitute for understanding the broader context. If you don't do that, right, what the rounds are going to look like for you and your opponent is basically people coming in and throwing one study, at the other team, and they throw a study back at you, and you throw an example of a country at them, and they throw a country back at you, and they're just ships crossing in the night, and you don't have any clear, coherent narrative to tell the judge like what really matters and what doesn't, and what they should be weighing and what they shouldn't, right? So you've got to work toward, with this very complex topic and all of this information, all these concepts, becoming literate enough to be able to tell a simple, coherent story, right? And we'll get to what those stories are as we go forward throughout the video. But if all you have is just a half dozen cards where you only know what's on the card, you're reading these technical terms, and you're just dependent on those, you're not going to have a lot of fun. It's going to be more or less a 50-50 coin toss proposition. And if you're watching this video, you don't want that. You don't want to go 3-3 in prelims and be done, right? You're here to try to win, and that's good. Last thing I'll say in terms of initial thoughts is that there is a very, very deep topic literature on this topic. There are tons of studies. There are tons of case studies for particular countries, massive meta-analyses, data all over the place. The IMF itself writes tremendous, quantities of stuff on its own website and in its policy papers about what it does, right? There is no way you can read all of it, right? But at minimum, as you prepare your case, when you look at the stuff that you're using, right, the studies that you are using, right, the data you are using, you have to be ready to tell a story on why your data and your studies are preferable to the other side, right? Is it a bigger sample size, right? Is it a big meta-analysis? Is it looking more specifically at an area that's important, like lower income countries or developing countries? Is it more recent, right? Has it been done since there's been some development in terms of how the IMF operates, right? Those kinds of questions that you need to be able to answer. If you're not ready to do that, again, you're just going to be throwing cards back and forth. So understanding why your data is better than their data, putting in the work and doing the reading are going to be key. But because there is so much to cover, we need to go ahead and get started. So we'll begin with definitions and framework. We will spend a fair amount of time on this, right? It'll be a lengthy discussion of what the IMF is, how it operates, how it's developed over time. Then we'll move on to the pro arguments, then the con arguments, and then, of course, some final thoughts. Okay, so definitions and framework. We're going to take a deep breath here because there's a lot to cover, so let's go fast. I'm glad I'm talking to debaters so they can understand when people speak quickly, right? In terms of general framing, I think the resolution is fairly straightforward. It specifies a cost-benefit analysis, and it seems like by using generic terms like benefits and harms, that pretty much everything should be on the table. So economic impacts, poverty-specific impacts, political impacts, reducing or exacerbating international conflicts, critical stuff like impacts on marginalized communities and ethnic minorities. The phrasing strongly implies that everything is fair game, right? Also, it's what we call an evaluative resolution, not a policy resolution. It asks whether something is good or bad. So there's no real need to worry about how something is going to happen, no fights over plans and stuff like that. And that's good. More focus on the substance. But there is one, maybe two framing definition issues that stem partly from the word outweigh. And here's how this issue goes, really briefly, before we start talking about what the IMF is, right? So the IMF has been around for 77 years now, I think, and it's had some very significant changes in its mission and how it operates, which we're going to talk about in just one second. How much of that history is fair game in this debate? How much is topical? How much is relevant? Outweigh in the resolution is a present tense verb. So does that mean that we are only debating the IMF today in 2021, or like at least how it's functioned maybe over the last few years, only the things that it is doing now in the present tense? Or does outweigh present tense just mean that we are doing the weighing right now, but everything that's happened in the past is still fair game in determining whether it's good or bad? I think either one of these positions is defensible. I think you just need to be aware that there is, using the term outweigh, a viable debate to be had about whether we should be focusing more on the present tense, or, for example, whether we can go back to the 1980s, 1970s, 1960s and look at that. Most of the things we talk about in this video are going to be kind of evergreen. At least since the 1980s, they've been relevant, but we're certainly going to focus on more recent stuff if we can, right? The other framing issue that comes up in a lot of topics is cost and benefits as compared to what, right? That's always something you want to ask yourself. Are we comparing the cost and benefits here to, say, a world where the IMF never existed at all? Or are we assuming that had there been no IMF, maybe some other institution would have stepped in, right? As in fact, you're seeing some institutions start to step in anyway now, like the New Development Bank, which used to be the Brick Development Bank, things like that, right? I don't know that this matters a huge amount on this particular topic. I don't really think it does, as it does on some resolutions, right? But I do think the most natural interpretation is we're just comparing a world where the IMF exists as it is with a world where you don't have an IMF, and we're asking which one is better. And if you are departing from that and you're using something different, think it through and be able to explain it to the judge. But I think that's the most natural interpretation. And with that, we turn to what is obviously the most important term of the resolution, which is the International Monetary Fund. And this is going to require some fairly deep discussion, and we're going to spend a minute on it. And that is entirely as it should be, because having a more in-depth understanding of it really will pay off for teams that are conversant and can do a better job telling a story, right? Number one, because what the IMF does, generally speaking, is just something not a lot of people know about, right? Even people who are sort of financially minded don't really understand the IMF unless it's just something they happen to be interested in. And number two, because the IMF has evolved over the years, it's changed, and we want to be able to explain what it's doing now as differentiated from what it did before, which is a fairly considerable difference, right? So let's start with the history of the IMF. Very briefly, when the IMF was established in July 1944 alongside its sister organization, the World Bank, it was done at what was called the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And we'll drop a couple of articles summarizing, very good links summarizing the general history of how this happened if you're interested. But it was 1944, the tide was turning in World War II, the Allies were thinking about how to set up these international institutions that were going to keep order and keep the chaos of World War II from happening again. Obviously, on the political side, the way that happened was through setting up the United Nations, right? But on the economic side, the Allies and other countries were very acutely aware that the sort of chaos, the financial chaos that led to the Great Depression, right? The isolationism and the separation of countries economically in Europe and, of course, in the United States as well, in the 1930s had been a major contributing factor in World War II. And so also on the economic side, they wanted to have institutions that could prevent that. So IMF's website actually explains this very nicely, as you can see here on the screen. The 44 countries in attendance sought to build a framework for international economic cooperation and avoid repeating the competitive currency devaluations that contributed to the Great Depression in the 1930s. The IMF's primary mission is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, the system of exchange rates and international payments that enables countries and their citizens to transact with each other. So when you read that, one question you might be asking yourself is, what is competitive currency devaluation? And why was it so bad in the 1930s that we needed to set up this massive international institution, actually two international institutions, right, to prevent it? Well, it's fairly simple, right? And I'm just going to take a second to explain what currency devaluation is. This is not something you're going to talk about in a lot of rounds, but it's just worth knowing to kind of understand the main evil that the IMF wants to try to prevent and sort of put it in context, right? So if you want to buy goods from a producer in another country, let's just use Japan as an example, right? You need their currency, right, which is the yen. So if you're a buyer in the United States, you need to trade some of your US dollars for Japanese yen, right? Now, the amount of yen that you get for each dollar, or whatever two currencies you're using, right, it's called the exchange rate, right? If the yen is considered a more valuable currency, then you will get fewer yen for each dollar. If the dollar is considered more valuable, then you'll get more yen, right? And you would think, like gut level, when you start thinking about it, every country would want their currency to be the most valuable, the strongest. You can get the most of the other guy's currency for your currency. But that is not always true by a long shot, because when your currency is devalued, when it is worth less in relation to other currencies, there are actually some major advantages, especially if your country has run into economic hard times. And we will link to an article from Investopedia explaining why countries devalue their currencies if you're just interested in that, right? So let me give you some examples. For example, while a devalued currency does make it harder for your people to buy goods from other countries, it makes it much easier for you to sell your goods abroad. It basically makes your goods cheaper in comparison to your neighbors, right? Because you're devaluing the thing it takes to buy them, right? That's not because you've done anything good. It's not because you're more efficient or you can make the goods faster or with less labor. No economic justification. It's just because you are printing a bunch of dollars or yen or whatever to artificially lower your country's prices. And when we say devaluation, let's be precise. There's several ways to do it, but the simplest one is to just print a bunch of your money, right? Print a bunch of your money so that there's more of it and each one is worth less, right? Another advantage of devaluing currency or just printing money is that it makes it easier to pay your foreign debts, right? So extreme example, if you owe $1 billion and you just decide, well, I'll double my currency supply, I'll print twice as much money, then you can pay that $1 billion for what is in effect in terms of value, $500 million, right? Because you got twice as much currency representing the same amount of value, right? And now, if you've taken a macroeconomics class, you can see how strategic currency devaluation can lead to some really bad outcomes. First, most obviously, massive inflation, right? You print a bunch of money, each dollar or pound or whatever is worth less. People's savings dry up, panic ensues. Also, if you artificially lower the prices on your goods, your neighbor may want to protect its industry by raising them back up through things like tariffs, right? Which means a possible trade war. And without spending any more time on it, right? The delegates at Bretton Woods in 1944 and the IMF today are right about one thing, right? Currency manipulation and devaluation did help lead to the Great Depression, and it does still contribute to international tension today, as you can see when you look at the conflict between the United States and China, when the United States is accusing China of devaluing its currency, right? So in 1944 at Bretton Woods, these 44 countries wanted to try to keep this pattern of devaluation and conflict from happening and repeating itself. So how did they do it? Well, there were a couple of competing plans. The two main ones came from John Maynard Keynes, the renowned British economist, the father of Keynesianism, right? And Harry Dexter White, who was a U.S. Treasury official. And eventually, they reached a compromise, and it worked like this. They would set up this organization called the IMF. They would also set up the sister institution called the World Bank, which we will talk about briefly later, right? And the IMF would sort of be like a club for countries that wanted to promote stable monetary policy. In other words, stable currency valuation and the free trade, peace, prosperity, and all those things that they believed would accompany it. The club would have 4 features. Now, actually, this is a gross oversimplification. I'm going to tell you right now, it had a lot of features, right? But 4 relevant, simple features for purposes of this debate, right? Number 1, it would have rules about what monetary policies that members could enact, specifically a fixed exchange rate that we'll talk about in a second. Second, it would have dues or quotas that members would have to pay. Third, it would use those dues or quotas to essentially create a bank that could lend members money if they found themselves in economic trouble. And fourth, it would have a bunch of economists and experts on staff to advise member countries and also to set the conditions for those loans. So let's talk about each of those 4 features, and that will kind of organically walk us through the development of the IMF. So first of all, what are the rules of this club that we're creating? Well, when the IMF was founded, the basic rule was that all members were going to set their currencies at what was called a fixed exchange rate, right? Now, we don't have time to go into depth on this, but basically, when you joined the IMF, your currency was, and I say was because this is not the case anymore. Let's be clear, there's no fixed exchange rate anymore, right? But it was pegged to a certain value in relation to all the other currencies. And the standard that they used for pegging your currency to a certain value was the US dollar, because the dollar was seen as the most stable currency in the world at the time. So maybe a French franc is worth 0.75 US dollars. Maybe a British pound was worth 1.25 US dollars, right? And the US, in turn, to give this all something to link to, something objective to value this at, agreed to set the value of its dollar based on gold. So every dollar would be worth 1/35 of an ounce of gold. And actually, you could go and redeem your dollars for actual physical gold from the United States Treasury. And there's an excellent summary of how this worked from the balance in 2020, but it's no longer the rule, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But basically, the idea was, if your currency looked like it was starting to get devalued, right? There's too much of it floating around, its value is going down, then the rules of the IMF said your central bank, right? The Fed in the United States, or whatever your central bank is, they would have to buy some of it up, right, to bring the value back up. And if there was too little of your currency, well, you paid money into the IMF would just distribute some of your currency to bring the value back down to keep it from going too high. And in this way, we would keep all of the exchange rates more or less even. There wouldn't be any currency devaluation. We'd all get along and trade and be happy with each other, right? Now, you might be asking yourself, where did the IMF get all this currency that it was going to distribute out in order to keep these things stable? And that gets to the second part of the system, which is the membership dues, right? Each member country of the IMF has to maintain what's called a quota amount, which is an amount of money that it gives to the IMF based on the size of its economy and certain other factors, right? So if you think of the IMF as being like a bank or a credit union, the quota is the minimum balance that each country has to keep in its account. And the voting power that you have in the IMF also goes right along with the amount that you contribute. In other words, your voting power is tied to how much you contribute. And so as you can see in this chart, the United States contributes about 17.5% of the quota money to the IMF, and its voting share is about 16.5%. Right? Now, back in the 50s and 60s, you could use these funds to keep the exchange rates in line. So, for example, if there was a shortage of British pounds in South Africa, you could allocate some pounds there, right? And if there was too much, then, you'd have to buy it up. And that's how the system worked. But all that ended in 1971 when Richard Nixon decided that the United States was no longer going to peg the value of the dollar to gold. Why? Well, to put it simply, we were fighting the Vietnam War, we were entering a recession, and we just kind of wanted to devalue our currency, right? We wanted to make it easier for us to pay our debts because we were taking on a lot of debt. We wanted to make it easier to sell our goods. So we wanted the dollar to be cheaper, right? And so when the gold, it's not a true gold standard, but when the gold linkage was removed in 1971, within a couple of years after that, the whole system of fixed exchange collapsed. And we entered what we have now, which is called a floating exchange rate. And this is where the value of a currency, we just go back to, it's whatever the market will pay for it, right? And that's why when you listen to like financial shows on the TV or radio or podcasts, they might say things like, the dollar is up today against the euro, or the dollar is down against the yen, right? Because there are markets, right? People are buying and selling these currencies for whatever the strength of the respective economy is, right? And so you might be thinking, well, it sounds like that's it for the IMF, right? I mean, their whole thing is regulating exchange rates, and exchange rates are no longer regulated. They're just floating. So IMF's done, right? But not so fast, because the IMF is basically like the Miley Cyrus of international institutions. They have successfully reinvented themselves on multiple occasions. And in order to understand how, we turn to the third main feature that I talked about, which is lending money to member countries in dire situations, right? So the main thing that the IMF does post-1973, after these fixed exchange rates go away, is to make loans to member countries. Now remember, why do we have these loans to begin with? They've always been there. They've been there since 1944. Well, the idea was, if you want to keep all these countries sticking to exchange rates and not going crazy and devaluing their currencies, and you want to keep free trade open and not retreating into protectionism, you can't just tell them, don't manipulate your currency. You can't just say, don't print a bunch of money. You have to give them, when things get bad economically, some alternative to retreating into protectionism and trying to save themselves at the expense of their neighbors and trading partners. The policies where you put your own economic survival first, even if that means doing things that are destructive to the overall global economic order, you have to give them an alternative to that, right? Right? And the alternative is, if you are an IMF member, you can borrow some money from the IMF, use it for whatever you think you need to, pay down other higher interest debts, fund government expenses or liabilities, invest in your private economy. You can do whatever you need to do with it, right? And the amount you borrow, by the way, for reference, is measured in sort of a quasi-currency used by the IMF called special drawing rights, or SDRs. Now, when you hear SDR, it's not nearly as important as it used to be, right? But it is just a way of sort of keeping track of the actual amount of money you're borrowing, because they have all these currencies that their members use, right? So they have this, this quantifier, right? This unit of account called special drawing rights that's pegged to 5 different currencies. Not super important, but when you see it used in the literature, now you'll know what it means. It's just kind of their accounting unit, right? Now, these loans are different from loans done by the sister institution, the World Bank. The World Bank is focused on specific development projects in developing countries. So, for example, building health centers, building schools, building water infrastructure or electricity infrastructure, that kind of thing, right? And we'll include a good link to an article explaining the difference between the World Bank and the IMF, because you definitely don't want to get confused about that and treat, for example, the IMF as an anti-poverty development agency. It's not that. And if you talk about it like it is, you're not going to have a good time. IMF loans are really not narrowly targeted. You use them broadly across your government and your economy to address what's called your balance of payments, right? And your balance of payments is a really important concept in the history of the IMF. It's just how much money your country is sending out, right, in trade and in other payments and things like that to other countries versus how much it's bringing in, right? And if you're running a big deficit, a big trade deficit, you owe a lot of debt, whatever, right, and you can't pay for it, right, we start to get worried. We as the IMF and the international economic order, we're worried. Oh no, you're at risk. You might go and devalue your currency, engage in trade protectionism. We don't want you to do that. We want you to remain a responsible global citizen. Keep paying your debts. That's what we want to have happen, right? So we will lend you X number of billions of dollars to pay down debts, fund the government, stimulate the economy, whatever you need to do. And to be clear, it's a loan, right? It's not charity. The IMF is not an aid agency. They may talk like they have all these high ideals, but they are not an aid agency, right? You are going to pay it back, typically within 3 to 5 years, and you're going to pay interest on it, right? And typically the interest is going to be a little bit below what like private market would lend at, right? But it's not zero. It's not concessional lending, right, where there's no interest rate. And typically, we call the IMF what's called the lender of last resort, because in many instances, it is who you go to when you can't get like private entities, big companies, other countries, right, other international institutions. When they're not willing to lend to you, or at least when they're not willing to lend to you at a reasonable rate, the IMF is who you can go to, right? But what the IMF doesn't want to have happen, especially if you're in dire need and you've got a bad economic situation on your hands, is it doesn't want you to get this loan, spend it, and then nothing changes, right? You keep doing whatever got you into the financial trouble in the first place. And that's why they put conditions on these loans. And these conditions are kind of the core of the criticism of the IMF. So you remember when we said there's this fourth feature of the IMF, that they have all these economists and experts working for them, evaluating economic positions of member countries, right? Well, most of the time when they do this, they are essentially just publishing reports, what they call surveillance of individual countries or like global phenomena like COVID-19 and the economy, right? And they may make recommendations. They may say they think that what you're doing is not wise or that you should change it. But these reports are non-binding, right? People may pay attention to them and may be less likely to do business with you, but they don't have any binding legal authority. But when you get an IMF loan, right, when you accept an IMF program, right, these same experts will take their policy preferences for what you should do and make them binding. They will be made into conditions of the loan, right? And these conditions are called structural adjustments. You're going to adjust the structure of your economy, of your policies, or structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, right? So that's an important acronym, SAPs. Opponents of the IMF would contend that the acronym is no coincidence because SAPs are for SAPs. That's my one joke on that. A good summary comes from Investopedia, as you can see here, giving you some examples of what they may make you do. Ironically, in some cases, they may tell you to devalue your currency in a limited way, right? They may tell you to cut public sector jobs or subsidies or spending, privatize state-owned businesses, deregulate state-owned industries, ease regulations, close tax loopholes, things like that. And as you can see, a lot of these policies are things that don't really seem to help the masses, right? They're not things that are aimed at, at helping the masses. They're more interested in helping the sort of macroeconomic ability to pay debt, like cutting public sector employment, right? Anyway, we've always had conditions on these IMF loans, partly because IMF wanted the country to get back on its feet and pay back the money. But in the 80s, the IMF started getting a lot more members that were in the developing world and started lending more to developing countries. And whereas it had previously given sort of more general macroeconomic conditions like, lower your total debt, in the 1980s, it started getting much more specific with these conditions, right? As we saw earlier, right? Instead of just like, you need to spend less, it was you need to cut this agency by this percent, close this tax exemption, shut down this aid program, privatize this government agency. These are things that arguably can hurt the poorest people in the country in the service of making it more economically viable on a macro level, right? Better able to pay its debts to these rich international folks, right? And at this point, it becomes important to think about who really runs the IMF. Earlier, we said that the voting power in the IMF is based on quota amounts, which are based largely on your GDP. So that means that the countries calling the shots and hiring the staff at IMF are rich countries. They are participants in what we call the neoliberal capitalist system. They're the winners in that system. They are, in a sense, the 1%. And you are basically borrowing their money because while everybody contributes, they contribute most of the money. The IMF has 190 member countries today, but over 50% of the funding and thus over 50% of the voting power lies with 10 relatively rich developed countries. Most IMF actions require 85% of the membership to agree, which means that the United States, which has 16% of the vote, has a one-country veto. Several other countries like Japan, India, and China can also come together to essentially veto in groups of 3 to 5 countries. And not to put too fine a point on it, right? But think about who really runs those countries. There's certainly an argument that big financial interests, big corporations, and the rich have a hugely disproportional influence on major developed countries. So the argument goes, when they impose these conditions on loans, they are not going to be focused on what's best for the people of a developing country, particularly the poor people. Whatever they tell you on their website or in their press releases, they're going to be focused on making that country into the most efficient participant in the global neoliberal capitalist system, the most efficient payer of debts that it can possibly be. And that is often very different from what people would choose democratically, and it is often very different from what actually makes their lives better. At least that's the argument, right? So, before we move on to arguments, what is the IMF today? Well, there are several very good articles with plain language explanations that we will link to, but the really short version is this. Since it no longer sets exchange rates, IMF is basically a bank, right? Or to be more accurate, it's sort of like a credit union, because a credit union is essentially a bank, except you join it and you become a member. Right? And in this credit union, you pay in your quota, and the credit union, the IMF, watches how you run your economy, and it writes reports to advise you and others about how you're doing. And none of this advice is binding unless and until you borrow money from the IMF. But if you do, right, you are on the hook to implement whatever structural reforms IMF demands as a condition of the loan. They use that $1 trillion endowment to get you to sign the loan, but as a critic would say, you're sort of signing away your soul, or at least some of your sovereignty, right? Now, the IMF would tell you that these structural adjustments in these loans are essential to avoiding the kind of short-sighted, self-interested, destructive policies that led to the Great Depression and led these countries to get into this trouble in the first place. And this is just sort of a form of tough love that puts necessary limits on these countries to get them back on their feet so that they can be prosperous. Critics would tell you that these structural adjustments help the global rich maintain their profitable capitalist system by sacrificing the interests of the poor, that they subvert the democratic process, and that in the long run, they don't leave the borrower country, in many cases, any more stable or solvent than it was before. And those are the two competing narratives about the IMF. I know it's taken a long time to get here, but I feel like by doing this and by having you read some of the things we just mentioned that are going to be cited in the notes, you're going to be in a lot better position to tell a story about the IMF rather than just jumping from card to card. But I know you like jumping from card to card. I know you like the big impacts, right? So let's move on and now talk about main arguments on the pro. All right, let's do some pro arguments. I actually think the pro has a pretty compelling, simple story that it can tell to a lot of judges, and it sort of goes like this. The pro is going to basically say, look, The IMF is a voluntary organization. Nobody forces anyone to join it or to use its programs. And it may not be perfect and it may not always achieve its desired results, but there's plenty of evidence that in most cases it does. Most of the time, most of the countries that borrow from it, most of the countries that join are happy, right? And the strongest evidence is that member countries continue to be members. They don't leave, right? And they continue to borrow from it, right? So as the pro, all we have to do is show you that these countries aren't crazy, right? They're not completely misguided. We as high school students don't know better than they do, right? And you should keep the IMF as a tool in the economic and financial toolbox for these countries. And if having it as a tool is better than not having it as a tool, then you should be voting for the pro, right? Unless there's overwhelming evidence that it's almost always bad, you should basically default to pro because all we're doing is giving countries a choice, right? So with that, I want to go kind of in order from what I consider to be like the most important, like essential arguments to some of the more optional and maybe even a little bit more tangential ones, right? So let's start with the one that I think everybody has to at least know, even if you don't put it front and center in your case, and that is that the IMF helps prevent economic crises, right? This is the core of the IMF's stated mission, right? Is to prevent countries from descending into crisis when things get bad, to act as a sort of financial firefighter, because when an economic crisis hits one country, it can quickly spread to others, right? So right off the bat, whether you use this as a key feature in your case or not, you need to be able to explain why it meets its own mission statement, right? By making the global economy more stable, and to explain why that stability is a good thing. And luckily, there's plenty of evidence on this, right? So starting off with like preventing currency crises. So from Dreher and Walter in 2008, they have just evidence that explains that once in a crisis, IMF programs significantly increase the probability that the authorities devalue the exchange rate. The amount of loans and compliance with conditionality have no impact. Our results suggest that the IMF, contrary to the fund's critics, does indeed fulfill its functions of promoting exchange rate stability and helping members correct macroeconomic imbalances. A little bit complicated, but basically, empirical evidence says they do what they say they'll do. They prevent currency crises and wild fluctuations in valuation, right? So they do what they say they're going to do. Okay, that's a good start. What about other types of crises, right? Well, banking crises. So Poppy and others in 2015 explains why the IMF helps prevent banking crises. And it just says our results indicate that countries participating in IMF-supported lending programs are significantly less likely to experience a future banking crisis than non-borrowing countries, right? So just more good evidence that they are in fact, on balance, overall, when you look at the whole world, fulfilling their goal of preventing countries from descending into economic crises. Now, one thing I think that you have to be able to do as the pro when you're talking about this idea of sort of being the firefighter and stopping crises is to be careful to explain what the impacts of financial crisis are. Like, it's not just a drop on the balance sheet for corporations. It's not just like a sort of theoretical thing on an economist's chart, right? It is an actual major significant harm to the health and livelihood and sometimes even the lives of millions of people. So this is a piece from Otkar Robe and Podpiera, I think, in 2014, and it just talks about like the practical social impacts of financial crises. It's a good piece that looks into the 2009 global financial crisis to explain that crises like this aren't just abstract economic ideas. They hurt real people in measurable ways. They push millions of people into poverty. They increase unemployment. They have negative health outcomes. They even increase suicide rates. So when we talk about avoiding these crises and being the firefighter and keeping them from spreading, right, we're not just talking about making the rich richer. We are talking about avoiding massive negative impacts on real people's lives. And IMF is empirically helping to mitigate these harms in these crises that hurt real human beings. I think that's important. The second major point is to just go back to the narrative. I want to spell this out in a little bit more detail, but it's the idea that the IMF is completely voluntary, right? I don't know if this is a standalone contention, but I think it's a theme. Maybe you put it in a framework, maybe you use it prominently in your crossfire, maybe you use it prominently in rebuttals, but it's a theme that has to be included, I think, in every pro case, right? And the theme is just this. Everything the IMF does with member countries is completely voluntary. Nobody is being or can be forced into any agreement or arrangement that they don't want to make, right? Membership is 100% voluntary. It started out with a few dozen countries, and generally they were more developed countries, but from the late 60s to the 90s, you saw countless developing countries join, and now we're at 190 members. Remember that any member can leave anytime they want. Article 15, Section 1 of the IMF Charter specifically says that you can withdraw anytime you want, right, by just transmitting a notice in writing. You just write a letter to the IMF, and it is effective on the day it's received. As soon as they get that sucker, you are out. You even get most of your quota contribution back in most cases, right, as long as you're not, indebted, but you can get most of your quota contribution back, right? More importantly, if you're a member taking a loan and the accompanying structural adjustments, right, the conditions from the IMF is also completely voluntary, right? You don't have to do it if you don't want to. And lastly, there are alternatives, right? It's not like people use IMF because there's literally no other funding in the world that a person can have. Every single country in the world borrows from countless sources. The U.S. sells its debt in the form of treasury notes to private companies, other governments, individuals. You can borrow from pretty much anybody if they're willing, right? There are even other international institutions that offer alternatives to the IMF, right? Like the New Development Bank, which used to be the BRICS Development Bank, and many others, right? And if you think you can get a better deal from somebody else, go get that deal, right? But IMF is often referred to as the lender of last resort because it's just one last option that you have if you can't get a viable funding deal from some other source. And the basic argument is, wouldn't you rather have that option, even if it's not the greatest option, than not have it? What's the harm of having that option? What's the downside of having the option, right? Why does this matter in a cost-benefit analysis? I think for a couple of reasons. First, and I like speaking in practical terms like this. I'm a big fan of it. Some of my best former PF debaters, like Mia Robertson, who sometimes co-hosts this with me, has gone from being a really good high school debater to an outstanding college debater, even better, I think, by incorporating this sort of plain language talk. And so let me tell you what I mean when I say plain language. You literally say, we are a bunch of high school students. We've had a couple of weeks tops to research this topic. We're going to have a few minutes to debate it, right? We should defer to the judgment of the leaders of the 190 countries who have chosen to join the IMF and not to leave it. They are not crazy. They are elected leaders with expert advisors who spend their whole lives focusing on this. They know their country's situation. They have looked at the pluses and minuses, and they have decided it is worth being a part of the IMF, having it exist, and in some cases, it is worth taking out a loan with the conditions, right? And there is no way in a few weeks of research and a half an hour of debating to overcome the presumption that these people are not nuts, right? They know, right, what they're doing, basically, and the presumption should be with them. Second, even if you don't believe that, shouldn't you at least have the option? Wouldn't you rather have the option? How does it make anyone worse off by having the option of an IMF loan or the option of IMF membership rather than not having it? And if you get an IMF loan and it goes badly for you, you can decide, well, you know what, I'll just never do that again, right? But if you get rid of the IMF, if you say that a world where IMF doesn't exist is better, then that option disappears forever for the many dozens of countries that actually do use it. And you're taking away something they are manifestly saying, voting with their feet, that they want, right? So the simple analogy I would use with the judges is just like, look, judge, imagine the IMF is a credit union, like literally a credit union in your town, right? Because that's the common comparison. People compare it to a credit union. So it's a credit union sitting there on the corner in your town. You know what? If you go in and look at that credit union and you say you don't like the interest rates, or maybe you've heard some horror stories that it went badly for somebody else and you don't want to use it, then don't use it, right? Don't join. But 190 countries have joined. So why do we want to take that away from them? If you don't want to take out a loan, don't take out a loan. But apparently many members of that credit union like the terms that they're getting. They want to have the ability to do it. So don't vote to say that taking it away from them would be a good idea based on what a couple of high school students did, over a week or two, right? So I think that's real talk. I mean, if it's voluntary, unless it's just overwhelmingly, blindingly obvious that it's always bad, you should leave the option in place, right? Third point I have on the pro is that IMF loan programs help low-income countries grow. The first of several articles on this that we found this is from Bird and Rowlands in 2017, and it just talks about the empirical evidence of IMF programs aiding growth in low-income countries. It explains, the IMF's mandate as it presented in its articles of agreement directs the fund to help bring about balance of payments adjustments without the need for countries to use measures that are destructive of prosperity. And then it just goes into an analysis that shows that programs programs by the IMF have a robust, statistically significant positive effect on low-income country growth over a 3-year horizon analyzed in the paper, right? And it is more pronounced for countries that have poorer growth before. So in other words, the poorer you are when you start, the more growth you're going to see, right? So it's just a solid article talking about the empirical record of leading to more growth. An even better, slightly less recent, but I think better article is from Boss and Stone in 2014. This talks about how IMF adjustments generally lead to economic growth. We're going to pop the money quote here up on the screen from them. And I want you to notice just a few things about it in this paragraph. First of all, it's not just, first of all, it's finding robust statistical support for greater economic growth after IMF loans and adjustments. But it's not just finding positive economic effects, it's also finding that even the sort of short-term negative effects of belt tightening and austerity that happen when you have to implement some of these adjustments, right? When you do these adjustments, right, you're going to have to tighten your belt, cut your spending, things like that. There should be some negative effect on your GDP in the short run, right? Because that has to happen. But what this study is finding is that those negative effects are lower with an IMF adjustment than they would be without. In other words, you're going to have to take some pain, right? You've dug yourself a hole. You're going to have to get out. There's going to be some sacrifice, but the sacrifice and the pain and the economic belt tightening is actually less bad with an adjustment from the IMF than it is if you just don't do the IMF at all. And this is a great block and a great response to the idea that, the IMF is leading to these situations of austerity. And the response is no, austerity to some extent was going to have to happen. The IMF is giving you funding to get through that process, and it's less bad. They also point out the lack of benefits from IMF programs, if you do have situations, right, where an IMF loan doesn't benefit the country, it tends to correlate heavily with like how desperate the country was to get a loan in the first place. In other words, the countries that were in the worst shape to begin with, right? So you can use that finding to say, what Boz and Stone tell us is that, when we see these horror stories and these bad situations where it doesn't work out, most of the time that's due to the fact that the country was just in such bad shape to begin with, not to anything that the IMF did, right? So that's a nice alternative there. And then lastly, there's Balgundas and others in 2013. And this just talks about the long-term benefits of the IMF to low-income countries. This is a nice source because it's a meta-analysis of dozens of other studies from the 90s and 2000s, right? So there's an argument that it prevents a more comprehensive, broader picture. And it basically says there's just a lot of strong evidence that low-income countries benefit from IMF intervention, right? It's not intervention, it's voluntary, but you get the idea, right? On a topic where we're going to be throwing a bunch of studies at each other, thinking in terms of a meta-analysis, a study of studies, right, with a broad database and being able to say, well, mine is a meta-analysis, it looks at a broader data set, right? That becomes important on a topic where we're all going to be tossing these big studies at each other, right? Now, we've been talking about how the IMF improves growth. It's easy to write growth off as being, growth is just for the rich, right? Growth is just sort of macro level impacts. It doesn't affect real people. So I like pairing arguments about growth. There's this card from Pritchett 2020 on how growth is actually key to poverty reduction. And what he explained, you read the whole article, it has a really good explanation, but basically what he says is like growth is the single biggest, as opposed to redistributing income within a certain amount, growth is the best way to eradicate poverty. There's no instance of a country achieving headcount poverty below 1/3 of its population without achieving the median consumption of that of Mexico. So if you want to lower poverty, you've got to raise the overall level of economic growth to around like that of Mexico, you see. So I think that's a good way to link and say, look, growth is not just about the balance sheet for rich people. It's about actually reducing hardships and reducing overall aggregate deep poverty, right? Number 5 argument I have on the pro is that IMF helps fight climate change. The IMF has made a major commitment to promoting green energy, carbon reduction generally, mitigation strategies for climate change, and other steps. All you have to do is look at IMF's own website. You'll find countless examples of policy papers, recommendations, blogs, you name it, all about the things it thinks countries need to do, right? So you can find, for example, IMF working papers warning about the economic impact of climate change on the globe and on the US specifically, like this one from Khan and others in 2019. You can also find countless speeches by IMF officials, blog posts, and so on. Earlier this year, IMF started integrating carbon emission costs into all of its annual assessments. This is where its economists go and do surveillance of countries and advise them, even if they're not taking out a loan, right? And this is meant to, in some ways, pressure and maybe even shame countries into doing more about emissions and more about climate change, and that's a good thing. IMF is also looking at climate change responses as one factor it will use in determining how much it will reduce debt loads of countries that owe it money. In this post-COVID world we have, this is from the Daily Sabah, I'm not sure what that is, but it's an article, and it talks about how in this post-COVID world, IMF is going about sort of reductions of debts because it recognizes how bad the economic situation is, and part of that will be linking it to your responsiveness to climate change, which is another good way to use sort of a carrot and stick to sort of force a response to climate change. And the basic argument here is that in a world where major powers like the US and to a lesser extent China are extremely reluctant to do what they need to do on climate change, it is a good idea and a good thing to have a major international institution pressuring them to do just that, right? The last argument I have on the pro, and I'm really addressing this one more because it's something I've heard discussed as a possibility. I don't think it's super strong, but it's worth discussing why maybe it's not super strong. And that is that the IMF promotes gender equality, right? And this is the idea the IMF is kind of doing a similar thing here to what it has done on the climate change front, publishing significant research and policy statements on gender inequality and basically arguing that inequality hurts overall economic productivity, withholding the ability to work and to be equal from women, right, prevents a country from being as prosperous as it could be. And for what it's worth, those are, most people would say those are good arguments to make, right? And so here's an example from a 2019 white paper. It's all very nice. Now, I've heard some people talking about how this is a good potential argument for the pro. I'm not quite as optimistic, mainly because unlike on climate change, where IMF is actually starting to take tangible actions, as far as I can tell, on gender equality, I cannot see any examples of IMF actually putting its money where its mouth is. In the last few years, it has started talking about gender equality, but so far as I can tell, for the most part, all it really is now is talk, right? And more importantly, on the other side of the coin, right now, there is some pretty good literature out there about how the sort of neoliberal capitalist world order that IMF promotes, and we're going to talk about that in just a second on the con, is actually really bad for women in the developing world, right? And we'll link to a piece from the Bretton Woods Project in 2017 that talks all about that, right? But I am, in my view, it's sort of actions speak louder than words, right? And the words that the IMF is putting out, being critical of gender inequality, are all very nice. But when you look at its overall impact on the world for women, it's much more debatable, right? And I think you could be running into a buzzsaw against a well-prepared team on that. So anyway, those are the big, pro arguments. We certainly didn't have time to list all of them. Like I said, it's a huge, broad topic, but we'll try to give you a bunch of links because there are so many of them in the notes below. And with that, we will move to what I think is the slightly stronger side, certainly the more fun side in this debate, at least for my money, which is the con. Okay, so let's get started on the con. I think there are sort of two basic philosophical approaches to kind of opposing the IMF system. The first is to just kind of flatly reject the kind of global neoliberal capitalist order that they represent, right? To say, it doesn't matter if they achieve these short-term gains here or there. They are key elements in an overall unjust system. This is sort of your more radical capitalism critique type argument. The big advantage is that you can catch pro teams off guard. If they're not prepared to debate the basic premise that this international capitalist system is bad, and you win that point, then it's basically game over for them, because there's certainly no question that the IMF is designed and geared toward maintaining that system. So if it's a bad system and the judge believes that, it's a pretty easy win. The disadvantage is it may be a little bit harder to run in front of lay judges, and it may take a little bit more time to establish. It's kind of a more complicated case. Now, the second approach is, I guess you'd say, sort of the more moderate angle that basically accepts that we have this sort of international capitalist order. We say that it is on balance good. We want countries to trade. We want them to be prosperous. But the IMF is basically doing a terrible job of promoting that order. This is your more sort of conservative case, right? More straight down the middle, right? The advantages here are that it's probably going to be easier to run with a lot of parent-type judges. Requires a lot less time to set up and run. You just come in and say, look, folks, IMF leads to civil wars, people die, IMF exacerbates poverty, IMF doesn't solve the problems it says it will. You list a bunch of different impacts, you have a lot of diversity. You can certainly do a combination of these two. You can talk about how sort of neoliberal capitalism is bad, but even if you accept it, the IMF does a bad job and messes it up, right? So there's a ton of room for diversity on the con side, a lot more room for creativity, which is why I kind of prefer the con side to the pro. I think it would be more fun to debate, right? And you should definitely take this opportunity to be creative. Maybe, maybe write more than one case on the con side if that's not something you regularly do. Whichever way you go, though, I will mention at the outset my personal favorite article on the con. I don't know if it's the best empirical article, but it's the easiest one to read and sort of summarizing major con arguments, is this from the Bretton Woods Project in 2019. It's just called What Are the Main Criticisms of the World Bank and IMF? And it does a really nice job of kind of laying them out one by one in plain English. So if you want to get started on the con and kind of understand the theory and the basic ideas underlying a lot of these things, that's a great place to go. But anyway, let's get started with kind of the broad capitalism, imperialism, bad type arguments, and then move to the more practical focused problems. So, number one I have on my list is the IMF enables Western imperialism, colonialism, that kind of stuff, right? And this really is one of the core theories that's out there in the literature, right? My personal favorite scholarly journal article comes from Salama 2016 on the IMF facilitating imperialism, and you can see some of the text here. But it basically tells the story of how, imperialism used to be you go and conquer a country, and that doesn't really happen as much anymore. And so what it says is neo-colonialism is achieved by connecting the economics of the newly independent countries, that is, countries that used to be like colonies, right, global south countries, to the economics of the imperialists. And it rests on financial institutions, especially the World Bank and the IMF that the West created. The loans and aid that the West offers to the less developed countries, not for the purpose of assisting the LDCs with development, but to dominate and control them. Thus, the powerful states behave like colonial powers, and this behavior is linked to colonialism in a post-colonial world. In lieu of direct military political control, Western powers employ financial policies through the IMF and World Bank to dominate less developed countries. And we'll probably link to some other sources on this because there are a lot of good ones, but these basic arguments are all sort of the same, which is that there is this order that is, in service of global capitalism. It's in service of a neoliberal order where we strive for profits. We put, business interests in a very high, important place. And the IMF is absolutely, unquestionably in service of that, right? It is the mechanism that wealthy capitalist countries use to coerce less developed countries to impose the rules that favor their system, right? And so instead of showing up and literally colonizing a country, the IMF waits until that country is in crisis and says, hey, we could get you out of this mess, right? We could give you a big loan. You could pay it back over time. All you have to do is agree to do things our way. Make some budget cuts, lower your debt, open up your trade, do things the neoliberal capitalist way, right? And the international capitalist way, according to critics, would be to keep you in debt forever, right? To keep you servicing that debt to these big interests, these businesses, these foreign countries forever, right? Definitely, we don't want you turning to populist policies. We definitely don't want you to turning something crazy like, socialism or something like that, right? Now, what can you link these arguments to, these critiques of like neocolonialism? Well, one option is to just go get your sort of standard cards that you can find on the internet from Policy Debate and other things about how capitalism is bad and dehumanizing and neoliberalism is bad and dehumanizing and has all these other problems, and just read those, right? You can just run a capitalism bad or a cap K, as they call it, argument, right? If you think that your judging pool is going to be a little more, down the middle than that, parent judges and things like that, I totally understand. I probably here in Mississippi, you would see a lot of that. So one thing you can do is just use the sort of colonialism bad arguments as kind of a framing mechanism, and then just transition into arguments that we're going to talk about in a second about all the practical problems and the practical exploitation that comes from IMF programs, right? You can just use it as kind of a framing mechanism to explain where it's all coming from without going all in on like capitalism is evil if you don't think your judges are going to buy that. But this is certainly a strategy that some teams are going to be using, and it's important that you be aware of it. But then sort of transitioning to the more specific arguments that you're going to see on the con, and there are a lot of them. So let's just get started. The first one is the idea that the IMF is anti-democratic, right? So remember that the IMF itself has, democratic deficits in how it's run, right? IMF governance is based on quota contributions, right? Which in turn is based largely on GDP, which means, as we said earlier, a handful of wealthy countries will have wildly disproportional influence, with the U.S. having 16% of the vote, despite being just one of 190 member countries. And because most IMF actions require 85% approval, as we said earlier, rich countries, they're somewhat limited in their ability to push things forward, but they absolutely can veto anything they want, and that includes the United States having a one-country veto, right? Even among relatively prosperous countries, and even assuming that determining votes by GDP is fair and legitimate, the power is still not fairly distributed in the IMF. So Mohammed 2020 notes that even within that system of allocating votes based on your GDP, you find that other countries, somewhat less developed countries, actually have less of a voting share. So, for example, the United States controls about 16.5% of the vote and has about 17% of the GDP in the world. But if you look at the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and so on, these countries had 11.4% combined of IMF voting rights, despite having 21% of global GDP. So the system within the IMF is rigged against, these aren't developing countries, but these are countries that are behind the United States in terms of wealth and prosperity. Even worse than that in terms of how it's governed, you may not know this, but the IMF actually follows an informal but uniformly observed racist rule that its managing director must be European. And I was kind of amazed when I read this. But this is from The Guardian 2019, and you can find numerous other sources. This is not a formal rule. It's not written anywhere in the policies, but there is a thing called the Gentleman's Agreement, right, in the IMF that says that the director of the IMF has to be a European, chosen by the European members, right, and the head of the World Bank has to be a U.S. citizen. This is an unwritten convention. And there are numerous, criticisms of this. So McQuashie in The Guardian just talks about how it simply can't be right that the leadership of the institutions with the greatest power to tackle the climate crisis excludes applicants from those countries where that crisis is wiping out the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. The IMF aims to create sustainable growth and to reduce poverty in the world. How can it do so when it is run on fundamentally undemocratic principles? And frankly, I would argue, fundamentally racist principles. I know that, obviously not all people in the European Union are of the same race, but there's a high likelihood, right, that they will be. And if you look historically at who these people have been, this Europeans only rule is a deeply troubling thing, right? It sort of cements the idea that, how could you ever trust an institution here in the United States to do right by people of color if there were an unwritten rule that the head of it had to be, from maybe not white, but had to be from an overwhelmingly white community? I think we'd all have a lot of problems with that. And I would find a way, if I were you, to bring this up to the judge in terms of explaining the context of it, just how out of touch IMF is with the needs of the developing world, because this is an astonishingly biased rule, right? In addition to being undemocratic in its own internal structure, the IMF also, its adjustments also undermine democracy. And the basic argument here is that IMF terms are negotiated by elites, national elites and IMF elites, in sort of a locked door session where the people of the country don't have any say. And they do things like reducing social spending, tightening monetary policy, making these sort of austerity decisions that we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second, right? But these decisions to cut back on social spending, right? And the poor and regular people aren't involved in that discussion. And the deal is signed, and no matter how much the majority or the voting populace doesn't like the decision, the country is then legally bound to follow these cuts, right? And the literature is summed up very well in this piece from Sofo Georgios. I'm probably butchering that name, and others back in 2017. But this is a really good summary of a lot of the literature on the anti-democratic effects of structural adjustment programs. I'll let you read and sort of mine it for sources and pick your favorite one if you want to run this as a contention. There are plenty of them. I will say, however, that this point is hotly contested. There is empirical evidence out there that looks at how IMF programs impact democracy in recipient countries, and it suggests that actually SAPs don't really do any harm, with both IMF participants and non-participants seeming to get more democratic over the last couple of decades, with the IMF programs and payments really not making much of a difference. And that comes from Nelson and others, 2016. Just talks about how the impact of the IMF on democracy is really not all that clear. This is certainly an argument you're going to see. You're going to want to prepare arguments and blocks on both sides, so just wanted you to be aware of it. The last thing I'll say about democracy is that, I would hope that, making a country less democratic would be enough of a terminal impact that nobody would question why that's bad. But if you need one, there is this really good piece by Lang from 2020 on how IMF's anti-democratic effects actually do harm income inequality, right? So he's got a good piece where he talks about how IMF programs exacerbate income inequality, and these exacerbating effects are worst in places where the IMF programs are constraining democratic decision making. So if you want to link democracy one step further and talk about how less democracy under the IMF leads to greater income inequality and things like that, you can do it with the Lang piece, right? The big one that I think almost everybody needs to run some version of is the idea that IMF mandated austerity hurts the poor. Remember, one way or another, we're telling the narrative here that the IMF is basically about the interest of international creditors, big businesses and other foreign countries, right? Making sure that they get paid. And the basic criticism here is like, for all its recent rhetoric about fighting poverty, the IMF is still an organization that is overwhelmingly funded and governed by global economic powers, which are in turn overwhelmingly dominated by wealthy interests. And these adjustments that they impose don't consider the welfare and the well-being of the poor or even the middle class in a lot of these developing and lower income countries that they see. So if you want a solid, plain language explanation of just how this works in practical terms, there's a good, long, bullet-pointed, clear piece by Anup Shah in 2013 on how SAPs actually lead to greater suffering and poverty among people in developing countries. That, to me, is the simplest explanation, and I'd recommend reading it. But there are plenty of other sources on the particular impact. So just a few examples, and we'll link to these and maybe some more. Thompson and others in 2013 have a finding that SAPs from IMF hurt maternal and child health. The quote is, "Our review finds that structural adjustment programs have a detrimental impact on child and maternal health. In particular, these programs undermine access to quality and affordable health care and adversely impact upon social determinants of health, such as income and food availability," right? Cutting back on social spending, cutting back on health spending, cutting back on education and other things in order to meet the terms of these loans is going to adversely affect, mothers, parents, and children, right? If you want a piece that talks about how SAPs exacerbate income inequality, there's this one from Forrester and others in 2017. And of course, there are plenty of country-specific examples of how these structural adjustments have made specific countries worse off, like, for example, Mexico in the 1990s. So Hessler in 2018 has a good piece with a lot of examples, but he talks about IMF's adverse impact on Mexicans. And he says in 1995, Mexico was hailed as a shining example of the IMF's new policy, as the country had repaid a bailout package to the tune of $52 billion. It would only take a few years that its failures became obvious. Mexico's citizens suffered a sharp decline in real per capita income, which in 1998 had fallen back to a level last seen in 1974. So they lost 24 years, a quarter century of income growth, right, allegedly as a result of this structural adjustment from the IMF. From the end of 1994 to the end of 1996, Mexico added $560 billion to its total external debt because the government bailed out mainly commercial banks to the tune of $545 billion by buying all their bad loans. So basically, this wonderful, sort of golden child example of Mexico in the 1990s not only didn't work, but it set the working people of Mexico back a quarter century in terms of wage gains, right? So good specific country examples. And I will say, when on either side, but certainly on the con, you're going to want to pepper your data and your statistics with a specific example or two. Mexico's a good example. We'll try to put some others in the notes that really give sort of a visceral picture of what happens when these SAPs fail, right? You're going to want to make sure you have a few of those ready to go. The best card I think I found on this, though, is one that you can label as the IMF itself admits austerity is harmful. And it's a piece by Ostry and others in 2016 published on behalf of IMF by IMF. It's an IMF paper, right? And it talks about why austerity in many cases does not work, right? It says, fiscal consolidation, sometimes called austerity, which is shorthand for policies to reduce fiscal debt and deficits, is what they are describing here. And they talk about how it doesn't seem to work in terms of making countries better off in the long run. They have three specific findings. First is that benefits in terms of increased growth seem fairly difficult to establish. So austerity is not leading to long-term growth. Second is cost in terms of increased inequality are prominent. So austerity hurts the poor, doesn't hurt the rich as much, exacerbates income inequality. And thirdly is that increased inequality in turn hurts the level and sustainability of growth. So by hurting income equality, we make it harder for the country to grow in the long term. This was trotted out in the real world as an example of how the IMF itself is admitting that imposing these conditions on countries is bad for them. And you should probably have it in your back pocket as a block that says, and you're going to have back and forth on this, but IMF itself admits that austerity is bad. There's another good piece from the Bretton Woods Project in 2019 that talks about why IMF austerity is not necessary. So one of the core arguments that the AF is going to make, the pro is going to make in many cases, is that, austerity hurts, but we've got to do it because, you have to sacrifice to get out from under this debt you built up and this crisis that you're in. But this piece basically says that actually, no, the UN has adopted a handbook on how to balance the social needs of people with the fiscal concerns that come from rising debt. And basically what the UN is saying is that we should be looking not to austerity or budget cuts, but rather to alternatives like restructuring debts to give longer payment periods, investing in social programs to help society be healthier and more productive, and to grow the GDP that way and to allow you to pay off your debts that way. And this is basically the opposite of what the IMF has required in many cases, which is more along the lines of budget cuts, austerity, scaling back programs, scaling back spending, right? So this piece actually paints IMF's methods as being totally out of step with the norms of how, forward-looking people think about dealing with national debts and balance of payments, which is exemplified by the UN, right? And the UN is pretty authoritative on these things. So these SAPs are not the only way to resolve debts. They aren't the best way. There are other better, more humane ways to do it, right? Another really good card is IMF adjustments protecting creditors and not protecting regular people. And this comes from Joseph Stiglitz, and he's a great source because he's actually a Nobel Prize winning economist who wrote an entire book criticizing the IMF. And he just talks in this interview about how the IMF is really there to benefit international creditors, these wealthy international institutions, businesses, sovereign governments, right? And he's quoted in an interview from the Global Policy Forum in 2011. And what he basically says is, these policies from the IMF protect foreign creditors. If you were to go and ask, the creditors for a country, a sub-Saharan African country or a Caribbean country or whatever, and say, what do you want this country to do to restructure itself? They would give you a bunch of suggestions about how, it needs to slim down, take money away from social programs, and make sure it's able to pay its debts, because that's what creditors care about. They care about you paying your debts, right? And he talks about how both Russia and Brazil, the IMF has essentially forced those countries to do things that favor, their creditors over their people, right? And the argument, he says, that's kind of implicit from the IMF, so, well, you have to do this, right? You have to pay off your creditors if you want to be a member in good standing of this international system, right? And his point is, no, that's not true. Bankruptcy happens all the time in every economic system. And in some cases, even if they can't get a loan anywhere else, these countries really ought to consider just defaulting on the debt. They ought to consider bankruptcy, insolvency, whatever they need to do, right? Sometimes they need to say, look, I'm sorry I can't pay my debts right now. If you don't want to do business with me in the future, fine. If you think it hurts my sort of credit rating or whatever that is, you just deal with it. But I have to focus on taking care of my people's needs right now. And what Stiglitz basically argues, not exactly here, but in other places, is these creditors will get over it, right? They'll lose some money. They took a risk loaning to countries that were having economic problems. And by doing these loans and forcing them to get paid back, you're really just bailing them out. You're not bailing the country itself out, right? You're bailing them out. They should just take their losses. And I guarantee you they'll be back sooner or later and the country will be fine, right? It needs to take care of its people right now. And then the last thing on austerity that I'll talk about is the idea that austerity hurts the poor even more post-COVID. And this comes from Oxfam International 2020. And it talks about how IMF loans, even specific to COVID right now in this great humanitarian crisis, are overwhelmingly geared toward requiring austerity. It finds that 76 out of 91 IMF loans negotiated with 81 countries since March 2020, when the pandemic was declared, required belt tightening that could result in deep budget cuts to public health care and other things. So even now, in the face of this great crisis that's had so much economic devastation, they're still demanding these austerity measures. A couple of more, esoteric out there arguments, but ones that I kind of like, is one I found was IMF involvement leads to civil war, right? Well, that's a pretty strong impact if you can link to it, right? So Hartzell and others in 2010 talk about how there's a correlation between IMF involvement in programs and actually leading to civil war, right? And the basic idea here, to kind of paraphrase it, is that these IMF structural adjustments go in and they just sort of rewrite the entire DNA of the country. They move things around, they close down institutions, they cut programs in ways that don't really look at the way that society functions. They don't think about like how society is structured and, what groups have, animosity toward other groups. They just go rip it up willy-nilly and rewrite the entire economy of the country. And what this does is it tends to increase conflict and tension and make the country more ripe for civil war, right? Now, I'm not going to read all of the data on that, but that's the basic idea from the hard sell piece. And if you want a good analysis of how this happens, there's a nice paper from Gowan 2007 that gives a good plain language explanation of how IMF restructuring contributed to instability and conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, to be fair, we will note that there are some responses, direct responses to this argument about saying that, well, if you look at it differently, if you use the threshold for civil war and you make it higher, that actually you don't see a greater likelihood of civil war. And this is from Midgard and others in 2014. So we will put that in there. Seventh, I guess, or maybe this is seventh, maybe it's sixth. It is hitting back on the idea of the IMF helping out on climate change. So what I've labeled this as is IMF actually hinders climate change solutions. Now, I'll say this is a little bit of an uphill battle. There's some pretty good evidence that IMF is now taking climate change seriously and actually taking action on it. But it's certainly not insurmountable. And either way, you want to have a block on this. Even if you don't think this is going to be part of your case, if you know you're probably going to get hit with the climate change impact from the pro, you want to have something where you can hit back and fight them to a draw at least, right? Make it a zero sum, and then you can win on other things. So this comes from Meinhardt in 2020, and this is on the IMF basically hindering the green COVID recovery. And basically what this says is that the IMF talks a big game about climate change, but when it actually does specific policy advice to its members, it doesn't walk the walk. It doesn't challenge things like fossil fuel subsidies. So, the way I might run this is I might accuse the IMF of sort of like greenwashing, right? It promotes climate change solutions publicly. It writes about them in blogs. It talks about them in speeches. But what this card here says specifically is that when they actually do policy advice to countries, the substantive policy recommendations that they make, they fail to take into account things like fossil fuel subsidies. They are not telling countries, hey, these fossil fuel subsidies that you have are driving down the price of carbon. They're driving up the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere, and they're causing climate change. IMF, if they really meant what they're saying about climate change, this should be one of the most important things that they're telling countries in their policy advice, which is you can't be subsidizing fossil fuels. But they're not doing that. They're leaving that out of their policy advice in many, many cases, if not all cases. And that just shows that they're being hypocritical, right? And they're basically saying one thing publicly and doing another, right? And then lastly, there's this argument, and it's more of a theme to the argument, which is that, like, if there were no IMF, there are plenty of other institutions that would be doing its work better. And so there's just this one piece from Mark Weisbrod in 1998 about how the Asian recession could have been solved and solved better without the IMF. And it talks about how, other writers like Thomas Friedman are saying, oh, the IMF came in and saved the day, right? But what he says is, well, if there weren't an IMF, would it have been worse? Right? What would have happened to Asia over the last year if there had been no IMF? First, it should be recalled that Japan offered last November to organize a regional bailout. They abandoned their efforts after the Clinton administration insisted that all assistance go through the IMF. While we don't have the details of the Japanese plan, it's unlikely they would have insisted on the harsh recessionary measures that the IMF has imposed. After all, the depression in South Korea, Indonesia, and other countries is cutting Japanese exports. This will make it much more difficult to pull Japan's economy out of its long slump. Right. So this just talks about how, there are single country bailouts, there are regional bailouts. Today, we're seeing organizations, like we said earlier, the New Development Bank, formerly the BRICS Development Bank, and numerous others that provide alternatives to the IMF. So you should, basically the argument here that I would use is you should discount any impact that the pro gives you about the IMF, like what would the world be like if there weren't one? If there weren't an IMF, other institutions that are less aggressive with these austerity measures would step in and fill a lot of the gap. So you can discount their impacts by however much you think that would happen. It might not be 100%, but there definitely are other alternatives out there. There are other institutions. There are, regional bailout things like we're talking about with Weisbrod here. So you can't assign 100% impact to anything that the pro is saying unless you assume a counterfactual world where literally nobody steps in to do anything to help these countries, right? And so those are the big arguments on the con. A few more of them in quantity than what you saw on the pro. I think more or less it's a balanced, argument on both sides. I probably enjoy the con a little more. But regardless, we're over an hour now, I think. So let's see if we can move along to some final thoughts. Okay, so final thoughts. Brought to you by Diet Coke. Not really, actually. Nobody funds us except Mississippi State, which is fine. We love that. We don't need ads. So this, as you hopefully can tell, is a data-intensive topic. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of peer-reviewed studies out there because the IMF is a massive institution asking all kinds of different questions, and there is no way that you can read every single one of them. To be successful on it, first of all, the more you read, the better off you'll be. But to be successful on it in a world where there are just hundreds of studies thrown back and forth, you need two things. The first is you need a narrative, right? You need a story. You need to, when you're on the pro, say, look, it's voluntary. Why in the world would we take away an alternative? When you're on the con, you basically say there's overwhelming evidence that it makes people worse off, right? Look who runs it, Judge. Look at what their interests are. Look at how they exploit people. They're trying to turn these countries into creditors at the expense of their people, right? You've got to be able to tell those stories, right? Secondly, it's explaining why your data and your sources are better, right? Recency, sample size, just the things that they look at and being able to explain why it's looking at a more relevant question. That's an important skill in debate. It's an important skill in life. But if you can't defend why your data is better than theirs, you're going to have a tough time on this, because there's really just no way to tell a complete story without using some fairly abstract data points. There's no single killer statistic for this $1 trillion global entity. You just can't do it that way. You can have the narrative, you got to back it up with data, and then you got to defend the data, right? And so that, I think, is going to be sort of the key to success on this. So anyway, it's been a really fun year so far. We're still going to do videos, of course, on NSDA Nationals. If this is your last video with us, thanks for watching all year if you've been here. Looking forward to seeing you next year if you're going to be back. But hopefully you'll have a good time. Maybe some of these state championship tournaments you'll do well, national qualifiers if you've still got those. At any rate, we'll close the same way we always do, which is reminding folks that debate is for everybody. So remember to work hard, have fun, and hail state.